Kim Soohyun stood in the center of the summon room, staring into the empty space that stretched endlessly before him. His fingers ran absently over a small marble, cool and smooth to the touch, the feeling of it oddly grounding. Despite the majesty of his surroundings, the ethereal glow, the towering celestial pillars, the whisper of some divine wind, there was a gnawing emptiness in his chest, something that had plagued him for as long as he could remember. Player Kim Soohyun, came a gentle, almost musical voice that reverberated through the room. It was familiar. So familiar, in fact, that it had become synonymous with his torment. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. It was Seraph, the angel, her voice as silken and divine as ever, though today it held a slight quiver, a hint of something deeper, more earnest. Player Kim Soohyun, will you permit me to ask again? Her voice was like a soft, soothing melody, but there was an edge to it, a quiet desperation. Kim Soohyun let out a heavy sigh, turning the marble over in his hand. His gaze lifted, but his eyes were distant, his focus unfixed as he let the words hang in the air between them. Time had lost its meaning for him. A decade had passed, 10 long, tormenting years, and yet here he stood, frozen in this moment, still struggling with the same void, the same unresolved ache that had been with him from the very beginning. Yes, he said quietly, his voice distant and flat, I truly wish to revert the time of Hall Plain. It was a simple, resolute answer, but it carried with it the weight of everything he had endured, everything he had lost. He watched as Seraph's stunning, celestial form flickered in his vision. She was beautiful, impossibly so. The very essence of purity and light. Her wings shimmered softly, casting a gentle glow upon the room. Her flawless skin and delicate features were enough to make anyone lose themselves in her presence. And yet, despite her undeniable beauty, Kim Soohyun felt nothing. Not anymore. I cannot consent to this, Seraph replied, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Every angel, including myself, cannot understand you. Kim Soohyun's lips twitched into the barest semblance of a smile, though it held no warmth. He had heard these words before, countless times, and they had never changed. It was always the same, a beautiful celestial being, pleading, reasoning, and begging him to reconsider. But it was futile. They would never understand him, not truly. No, he said coldly, his voice betraying no emotion. You misunderstand. I never asked for your understanding, Seraph. The silence that followed was heavy, palpable. Seraph's gaze softened for a moment, but it quickly returned to its familiar, distant composure. She had long since given up on understanding him. But she still tried. She always tried. Player Kim Soohyun, she began, her tone more composed now, but there was still a slight edge of sadness in it. You have accomplished everything that was asked of you. You have become the first to grasp the pinnacle of Hall Plain. Kim Soohyun said nothing, but inwardly, he knew she was right. He had reached the top, the summit. But it hadn't mattered. The Zero Code, the ultimate achievement, had granted him the power to reshape reality itself. He could undo the past, rewrite history, and yet it had only deepened the cold emptiness inside him. So what? He replied bitterly. Seraph seemed to pause for a moment, her brow furrowing as she continued, the Zero Code has granted you entitlement. With this power, you can do anything. You can return to Earth. You can rule Hall Plain. You can become something greater than a king. Kim Soohyun's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, the familiar weight grounding him in the present. His right hand brushed the cool metal as his mind wandered back to the first time he had come to Hall Plain. He remembered it well, too well. He had been just 23 years old, full of youthful energy and hope, returning home from his military service. That fateful train ride had changed everything. He had fallen asleep, only to wake up here, in the summon room, with an angel before him. The shock, the confusion, the fear. It had all felt like a nightmare. And yet, as he stood here now, a decade later, it was clear that it had been far more than that. It had been his reality. He had pleaded with Seraph then to return him home, to let him go back to Earth. But instead, he had been thrown into the rite of passage, a test that forced him to fight for his very survival. He had been thrust into a world where only the strongest lived, a world filled with unimaginable horrors and endless battles. And so, he had fought, clinging to the faint hope that one day, he would be allowed to return. But as the years passed, that hope had dwindled. It had burned out, leaving only a hollow shell of who he once was. Now, standing before Seraph, he was no longer the man who had arrived in Hall Plain. The person who had once hoped for a return to Earth was gone. Kim Soohyun's voice was cold, but there was an unmistakable bitterness in it as he spoke. I've had enough. 10 years of listening to your empty promises. I'm done with it. He lifted his sword, the steel glinting in the soft light of the summon room. It wasn't meant to strike, not really. The gesture was symbolic, a declaration of his final decision. Seraph, he said, his voice low but firm, I'm not asking anymore. I want to use the zero code. I want to go back, 10 years, to the moment I first entered this place. I'll repeat it all, every single moment, just to undo this torment. Seraph's expression shifted, the calm and collected mask faltering just a little. She had known this moment would come, but it still seemed to catch her off guard. I cannot consent to this, she repeated, though her voice lacked the strength it had once had. It is illogical. You would waste such power, such potential, just to go back? Kim Soohyun felt a flicker of irritation rise in him. He gritted his teeth. Illogical? What do you know of logic? 10 years of suffering, of loss. Everything I've gone through, and you call it illogical? A shadow passed across Seraph's face, and for the first time, Kim Soohyun could see the hesitation in her eyes. She had always been certain, always had an answer ready for him. But now, there was doubt. Player Kim Soohyun, she said, her voice quieter now, softer. You are not the same as before. I see it in your eyes. This decision, it will not heal the wounds you carry. Kim Soohyun didn't respond. He wasn't interested in her sympathy. He had heard enough words, enough offers of understanding. What he wanted now was simple, to go back and undo the mistakes, the pain, the loss. He was tired of living in the aftermath. I don't care, he muttered under his breath, I don't care about your reasoning anymore. He raised his sword once again, the blade crackling with magic. As he did, Seraph's figure flickered. She was still as serene as ever, but there was an unmistakable sorrow in her eyes. You will regret this, Kim Soohyun, she warned softly. His response was a cold laugh. I've already regretted enough. Without another word, he lifted the zero code, a small, shining marble in his hand. A single moment of decision. He had held it for years, but now, in this moment, he was ready to use it. As the dark blue light from the zero code began to intensify, Seraph's eyes widened in recognition. She had not expected this. You truly wish to go back? She asked, her voice shaking, almost pleading. Kim Soohyun nodded. His voice was resolute. Yes. Take me back, Seraph. To the beginning. I want to undo it all. A soft glow emanated from the zero code, brightening the room with an overwhelming light. It consumed everything, and as the light enveloped Seraph, Kim Soohyun closed his eyes. He didn't need to see it. He had made his choice. And now, he would face whatever came next.